Um, Welcome everyone and good evening. I'm Lena Rubin, Programming Associate here at Village Preservation, and I'm so glad you're all here with us this evening. A quick bit about Village Preservation. We have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We host roughly 75 programs a year, all of which are now virtual, and most of which are free and open to the public. Our events are meant to illuminate the cultural and architectural heritage, history, and depth, and the value of preservation in our communities. We're a nonprofit, membership-based organization, so your involvement and support mean the world to us. You can learn more at our website, villagepreservation.org, and please consider becoming a member or making a donation if you're able at villagepreservation.org/donate. We call our home the village, but it is also unceded traditional land of the Lenape and Munsee peoples. I want to acknowledge in this archival recording the Lenape and Munsee communities, and especially their elders, past and present, and express gratitude for their stewardship of this land, for contributing to its geography, and for the use of their language as place names. If you'd like to find out more, please reach out. I'm glad to offer resources. Just before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to talk a bit about a new resource on villagepreservation.org. The Greek Revival style defines many of our most beloved and iconic landmarks, not to mention ubiquitous everyday structures. So to mark this anniversary and its connection to our neighborhoods, we have created a story map of just some of the many wonderful examples of the Greek Revival style in our neighborhoods and beyond, along with information and details to make you an expert in spotting and understanding this elegant style. I will post a link to that in the chat. And I've got the great pleasure of welcoming this evening's speaker. Francis Morrone is an architectural historian and a writer. He is the author of 13 books, including Guide to New York City Urban Landscapes, the New York Public Library, The Architecture and Decoration of the Stephen A. Schwartzman Building with Henry Hope Reed, and architectural guidebooks to Brooklyn and Philadelphia. Morrone is the recipient of the Landmarks Lion Award of the Historic Districts Council and was named one of the 13 best tour guides in the world by Travel and Leisure magazine. Just a bit of Zoom protocol. Please feel free to use the chat to say hi, tell us where you're joining from, or to raise any issues or thoughts. If you have questions specifically for our speaker, please use the Q&A function on your screen. It will help me to keep track of your questions, and you can submit those at any point during the talk, and we will get to as many as possible. Francis, take us away.
Thank you, Lena, and good evening, everybody. I was asked to give a talk about the Greek Revival with an emphasis on the great Greek Revival heritage of Greenwich Village. Beyond that, I wasn't given any guidance, really, and so I had to think, how do I take this enormous subject and sort of try to make it comprehensible and interesting in 1 hour? And there were several approaches that I could have taken. I could have simply surveyed the Greek Revival buildings of the village, and that certainly would have been an interesting thing to do, but it also would have used up an hour very, very quickly without really helping you necessarily to understand what the Greek Revival was all about. The approach that I decided to take was to say a little bit about the origins of the Greek Revival, the whys and wherefores of what we call the Greek Revival, to suggest to you, first of all, that there is such a thing as the Greek Revival, because there are those who contend, and do so very passionately, that Greek Revival is a misnomer, that we shouldn't use the term, that it's an absolutely meaningless term. And I am on the other side of that debate. I regard Greek Revival as a perfectly legitimate term, although I do recognize that it blends into a lot of other things in the history of architecture in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, particularly the much broader movement that began really in the first half of the 18th century that we call neoclassicism with a capital N. Don't confuse that with neoclassicism with a small n. And it also blends, on the other end, in the early 19th century into what the architectural historian Henry Russell Hitchcock called romantic classicism. This gets very confusing for people who haven't sort of been living with it for a long time. And I'm going to sort of try to skirt the nomenclature part of it a little bit, but I do think that it is important to try to get a sense of what was happening in the history of taste, beginning in the 18th century, that led to a certain kind of architectural expression that Greenwich Village happens to be particularly rich in by virtue of the fact that the village had a great development spurt during the time when taste was where it was at. So I think without any further preamble, I'm going to do that thing that in Zoom land we call sharing my screen. Prior to March 10th, 2020, I never uttered the phrase share my screen in my life. And now I say it every day, sometimes twice a day, sometimes 3 times a day. So I'm sharing my screen, and I'm hoping that somebody out there, Lena, I think this may have to be you. I don't know how this will work, but can you, is my slide up on the screen? When things are in this webinar format, I don't get feedback from any of the participants. Yes?
So I can see it. I can see it just fine. And
all right, great.
Looks like others are confirming.
Okay, excellent. Ordinarily, when it's just regular Zoom format and not webinar format, I can see you. I have a little panel where I see everybody, and I ask you to just give me a thumbs up or whatever. So I think we're good. You can hear me. You can see my slide. That's half the battle. Yeah, at that point, I actually feel like saying good night. But anyway, we're going to continue. Everybody knows what that is up on the screen. We're going to come back to Washington Square North, but in what may be a surprising first slide for you, we see an elegant French aristocrat of the 18th century. Why am I showing you the Comte de Caylus? The reason is because he was the first person who really provided something like a thoroughgoing survey of Greek architecture. And this is the first thing that people really need to understand about what we call the Greek Revival, and why I think that that is a legitimate term. And it is this: prior to the middle of the 18th century, and do note the date of the publication of the Comte de Caylus's book, Recueil d'Antiquités, which was issued in 6 volumes in France between the years 1752 and 1755. Prior to about that point, our understanding, our basic knowledge of the architecture and artifacts of ancient Greek civilization was extremely limited. And whenever I tell people this, they're surprised. And they're surprised because doesn't our Greek inheritance go back much further than that? And the answer to that is yes, it does. Our inheritance of Greek literature, of Greek philosophy, of Greek language goes back much further than that. It was obviously one of the things that truly shaped Western civilization, but not Greek Architecture. Why should that be? It's because Greece was part of the Ottoman Empire, and I think that the original inspiration for focusing on the Greek revival right now for village preservation was that we are this year is the 200th anniversary of the beginning of the Greek War of Independence from the Ottoman Empire, 1821. But prior to that, prior to the middle of the 18th century, the access of Western Europeans to Greece was very limited. Greece wasn't part of the itinerary of the Grand Tour. Very few people had been to Greece. There had been nothing published about ancient Greek architecture. Greece was terra incognita. It was a very obscure place. And this changed in the middle of the 18th century. And this is well prior to the Greek War of Independence. So it wasn't the War of Independence from the Turks that changed the access to Greece. It was other things. It was a kind of thawing that took place in the middle of the 18th century that had to do with other wars that were being fought by the Ottoman Empire and the ramifications of those wars and so forth, which allowed a degree of access to Greece that begins with figures such as the Comte de Caylus and then moves on from there. Now, this was a revelation for people, and this is a very important point to understand. We already knew a very great deal about Roman architecture. Roman architecture was there. It was the source of everything. It was considered to be the wellspring of everything. We knew that the Romans had been influenced by the Greeks, but we didn't know to what degree they'd been influenced by the Greeks. We also just assumed that Roman architecture was a sort of a perfection of what they had borrowed from the Greeks, and that it was really the true source of classical architecture. The Renaissance in Italy, for example, was really based on Roman architecture. It had nothing whatever to do with Greek architecture. Now, when we began to see Greek architecture, when we began to figure out that it was something rather different from Roman architecture, related to it, obviously, but also very different from it, this new understanding was an inspiration to designers, to architects. And it also came at a moment. The opening to Greece and the increase of knowledge about Greek architecture came at a moment when not everybody, but a lot of people, such as this fella, the Abbé Marc-Antoine Laugier, who wrote a very influential treatise called Essai sur l'architecture, which was published in 1753. Laugier and others were looking for a new architecture, following what were perceived to be the excesses of the Baroque and the Rococo. There was a yearning among many people to kind of go back to something that was more elemental, something that was sort of going back to the roots. Which is what the word radical means. It was a radical approach to architecture. When you read Laugier, and his description of what he termed the primitive hut, which is what is illustrated in this marvelous engraving frontispiece to his essay. You might think that he was talking about Bauhaus modernism. That's almost what you would think reading him. But in fact, what he was interested in was sort of getting rid of the Baroque excesses of architecture and going back to something that was purer, something that was really based on the columns, based on the idea of the columns as supports of a superstructure, of an architecture that really was boiled down to the idea of the columns as supports, kind of basically a post and lintel architecture, going back to the sources. And this, one architect who was deeply influenced by this was Soufflot in his church of Saint Geneviève, which we now call the Panthéon in Paris. It doesn't look like a back to basics sort of architecture to us because it's still a very richly ornamented architecture, but it was a movement in this direction. But the increase of knowledge of Greek architecture jibed so completely with this new mood that was given expression by people like Logier that it was kind of impossible that these Greek forms wouldn't sort of take immediate root and begin to influence architectural practice. And though we would not call a building such as Les Deux Rotondes de la Villette in Paris a Greek Revival building, nonetheless, it is deeply influenced by the new knowledge of Greek architecture. He uses a Greek order in this building, as does Langhans in the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. This is the Greek Doric, and which is different in several respects from the Roman Doric, and we'll get back to that. But these are some examples of the Greek, or as they often said back then, Grecian influence in architecture. A full-blown Greek revival was inevitable, and it did come. It began in some places in the late 18th century and others in the early 19th century, and it began to yield some very, very important buildings, such as the British Museum by Robert Smirke, such as the Royal Institution in Edinburgh by William Henry Playfair. The dates 1822 to 35. For the Anglophone world, the major text of the Greek Revival was the series of folio volumes that were produced by two Englishmen who explored Greece under the sponsorship of a British society called the Society of the Dilettanti. Now, these two men were James Stewart, whose nickname was incidentally Athenian Stewart, and Nicholas Revet. Stewart and Revet produced these magnificent volumes of measured drawings of Greek monuments made on site, and also featured what were known as reconstructions of the Greek buildings and Greek monuments. Not actual physical reconstructions, but reconstructions in drawings of what these buildings may and probably did originally look like. And these books in the English-speaking world were of immense influence, and they continue to be of influence to architects. The Antiquities of Athens, as the books were called, are available in reprint editions. They're just marvelous things. They're the kinds of books that if you own them, you periodically just pull them off the shelf and lose yourself in their beautiful drawings for, 2 or 3 hours. And this is an example. This is their rendering of the Parthenon, Volume 2, Chapter 1, Plate 3, from 1787. This is, again, this was the kind of thing that, given the mood of the time, given the sort of back to basics mood of the time, was just what the doctor ordered. Architects looked at this and what they wanted to do thereafter was to design the Parthenon over and over again. That's what the Parthenon looks like. The ruin of the Parthenon is partly the result of simply the passage of time, which brings ruin to everything, but it actually was greatly exacerbated by Venetian bombardment in 1687. So you see, this is what the Parthenon more or less looked like when people went into Greece and looked at it, but it was reconstructed by Stuart and Revett in the Antiquities of Athens. If you want a good sense of what the Parthenon looks like, you can always get it without going to what it looked like originally. You can go to Nashville, Tennessee, where the Parthenon has been rebuilt. It's actually quite a marvelous thing. But anyway, the influence of the Antiquities of Athens began to appear in the United States very early on in the works of an English architect who transplanted himself to America, became a very good friend of Thomas Jefferson, became indeed the most important architect in America in the early Republican era, and this was Benjamin Henry Latrobe. This is his Bank of Pennsylvania, sometimes credited with being the first true Greek Revival building in the U.S. That probably is an arguable point. It was built 1798 to 1801, and disastrously demolished in 1867. Believe me, village preservation never would have let that happen. But demolished it was. And it uses an Ionic order, the 6 columns across. We call that a hexa-style temple portico that was drawn from Stuart and Revett's Antiquities of Athens. Just a couple of other early, very important and influential Greek Revival buildings in America. Robert Mills was a great early American architect, many of whose works can be seen in Washington, D.C., but this particular very austere church, built 1812 to 14. So very early in the game, known as the Monumental Church, is in Richmond, Virginia, and it has what we call a distyle and antis portico, and I'll say in a little while what that is all about. This is the first great sort of American Parthenon, the first what we may call Parthenon-esque building in America, and it was designed by Benjamin Henry Latrobe's pupil, William Strickland. This, thankfully, is still standing in Philadelphia, 1819 to 24, the Second Bank of the United States. Strickland wrote, "The student of architecture need go no further than the Antiquities of Athens as a basis for design." Strickland is saying, so long as you have Stuart and Revett's books, you're done. You're done. I mean, everything that you could possibly want to design is in these books. But do note the dates of the Strickland Bank. It was begun in 1819, which was 2 years before the beginning of the Greek War of Independence. But by the time it was completed, the Greek War of Independence had not only begun, it was very much in swing, and it was something that was very much on the minds of Americans. Now, to be sure, the Greek Revival was not in any way, shape, or form an exclusively American affair. We've already seen that. It was something that took place throughout Western Europe, in Britain, and in America, and elsewhere in the globally in the colonial world of the time. And in every place where the Greek Revival flourished, there was some strong national identification with the Greek Revival. Everybody wanted to be Greek. Everybody wanted to be like the Greeks. Everybody wanted to claim the mantle of Greek civilization. And Americans were no different. What makes this somewhat amusing is that in every country, it was different reasons. In the United States, we sort of revered the idea of ancient Greece, not necessarily the reality of ancient Greece, but the idea of it. The founding fathers, so-called, were steeped in Greek thought, Greek philosophy, and so on and so forth. And so American democracy was thought to be a kind of modern rebirth of Athenian democracy, and so on and so forth. And so Americans believed that the Greek revival was an expression of American ideals. And when the Greek War of Independence began, not only was it, the Greeks, seeking to throw off the shackles of, the oppressive Ottomans, but Americans also in the early 19th century were, as really they loved it whenever anybody was fighting for independence. They saw a reflection of what America had done. They thought that America's revolution had inspired other people around the world. And so, America became this sort of great cheering section for liberation movements around the globe. And not least in New York, did organizations seek to aid the Greek cause. The Greeks contracted with New York shipyards to build warships for the War of Independence. There was a lot of fundraising that went on in New York. There were, concerts given, to support the Greeks. The Greek War of Independence, which lasted for 11 years, was a kind of international cause célèbre, in a way very similar to the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. Anyway, a British architect visiting America, a fella named William Ross, wrote in the British magazine, architectural magazine, in April 1835, the Greek mania. And that was a commonly used phrase, the Greek mania of the time. The Greek mania is here at its height, wrote William Ross, as you infer from the fact that everything is a Greek temple, from the privies in the back court through the various grades of prison, theater, church, custom house, and state house. Indeed, not only was it the case that every building type was designed in a Greek style, but it is also the case that the Greek style may be said to be the first style that was applied nationally. There were Greek buildings in Lexington, Kentucky, that were very similar to Greek buildings in Utica, New York. That it was a national, indeed some say the first national style of architecture in the United States. I just thought that I would quote these lines from a poem by Fitzgreen Halleck. Everybody knows the statue, that really awful statue of Fitzgreen Halleck that is on the Mall in Central Park. Fitzgreen Halleck was the most popular poet of the day in America at a time when, by the way, books of poems could be big bestsellers. So Halleck was known to the reading public in America, and his poem Marco Bozzaris was about a Greek general in the War of Independence. And the poem begins, the first 4 lines are, "At midnight in his guarded tent, the Turk was dreaming of the hour when Greece her knee in suppliance bent should tremble at her power." And the poem is this sort of great paean to the Greek cause. And the prevalence of Greek buildings in America is something that is even reflected in Samuel Francis Smith's song, America, which most of us know as "My country, 'tis of thee, I love thy rocks and rills, thy woods and templed hills." It's a reference, a direct reference to Greek revival buildings, which are now, in 1833, when the song's written, as American as apple pie. The Greek temple is as American as apple pie. But as I said, it wasn't just America. Lord Byron lost his life when he went to fight for the Greeks in the Greek War of Independence, what I mean by international cause célèbre. And it wasn't just in architecture. The Greek mania manifested itself in the other arts as well, in sculpture. For example, the most popular sculpture of the era was The Greek Slave by Hiram Powers. There are several versions of this, the earliest of which is from 1843. There's a version which was made by Powers in, I believe, 1860, which is in the Brooklyn Museum. But the one that you're seeing in this photo is from the Yale University Art Gallery. And in explanation of the statue, Hiram Powers, the sculptor, wrote, "The slave has been taken from one of the Greek islands by the Turks in the time of the Greek Revolution." And then he adds, and I love this, "the history of which is familiar to us all." Because in 1843, the history of it was indeed familiar to us all, if less so today. Some other great American Greek Revival buildings, this one making use of the Corinthian order, which was invented by the Greeks, though, as you probably know, very, very sparingly used by the Greeks, taken up in a big way by the Romans, so that we tend to associate the Corinthian order with the Romans and not the Greeks. But nonetheless, Thomas U. Walter, who was the architect of the United States Capitol dome, and one of the great architects of his era, used the Corinthian in this very beautifully proportioned octastyle temple, the Founders Hall at Girard College in Philadelphia. Walter also designed the home for the American banker and lover of all things Greek, Nicholas Biddle, the house known as Andalusia in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. This is Robert Mills's great U.S. Treasury building in Washington, D.C., which was the inspiration for Brooklyn's City Hall, now known as Borough Hall, designed by a man named Gamaliel King. In New York, the Parthenon rears its head on Wall Street in what was originally the United States Custom House, built between 1833 and 42 by like a whole cast of architects. It's a rather complicated story. I tell the story, by the way, in an essay about this building that is contained in a book called Classical New York, published by Fordham University Press, that has contributions by a number of scholars. My contribution is about the creation of this building, and so if you are interested in learning the very complicated building history of the Custom House, you can find it there. But the one figure whom we owe the final version of this building to the most is the last named in this list, a sculptor, not an architect, named John Frazee. But in any event, this is a very austere and indeed very powerful Parthenon-esque building. But here's the thing, and here is one of the reasons why there is this group that says there's no such thing as the Greek Revival. By the way, that group is more representative of archaeologists than of architectural historians. But they say, well, you go in to the old Custom House, which we now call Federal Hall National Memorial, and what do you have? You have what is in fact a Roman rotunda. What is with that? And the point needs to be made that there are indeed very few strictly Greek buildings, because you know that no Greek buildings have domes and rotundas, much less ones that are ringed by majestic Corinthian columns. This is a Roman space. It isn't a Greek space, but the outside of the building is very Greek indeed, even if the inside of the building is very Roman indeed. A building that has much to do with the history of Greenwich Village, because when sailors Snug Harbor gave up the leases on its Greenwich Village land for development, they went and bought land on Staten Island, so that the development of the Sailors Snug Harbor community on Staten Island was happened at exactly the same time as the construction of the buildings on Washington Square North between University Place and Fifth Avenue. These buildings were designed by Minard Lefevre, an architect who lived in Brooklyn and was one of the great figures of his age, both through the buildings that he himself designed, most of which, alas, have been torn down, but a number of which are still standing, such as these very impressive buildings on Staten Island. But Lefevre spread the Greek revival through the pattern books that he produced that were used by local builders in many parts of the United States, not least New York. But Sailors Snug Harbor is marvelous because it's this campus of Greek revival buildings, and it is truly a very impressive site. Some of them are full temples, some of them are not, and the ones that are not, we're going to come back to in just a moment. The style was so pervasive that it was even adopted by the Roman Catholic Church, that the Roman Catholic Church should design new churches in the style of Greek pagan temples. Shows you just how pervasive this style was. This is St. Peter's Roman Catholic Church. This is not the oldest Catholic Church building in New York, but it is the oldest congregation in New York. This is on Church and Barclay Streets. Far more common than the full temple front that you see at St. Peter's, however, is the much more modest treatment that you see at St. Joseph's Church, another Catholic church on 6th Avenue in the Village, 1833-34. And here you have what is known as distyle and antis. Remember, I've already said that a portico that has 6 columns across we call hexastyle. The word style, by the way, in architecture, well, it has many meanings, but one of them means means column. A stylus is a cylindrical form. Think of, an Apple Pencil. But in that stylus means column. Style, therefore, is the word that's what it usually means. A building that is called an astylar building is a building without columns, without styluses. 4 columns across is 6 columns, I said, was hexastyle. 8 columns is octastyle. 10 columns is decastyle. 2 columns across is distyle, style. And when we refer to a building as distyle in antis, this is what we're referring to. The Greeks did this kind of thing here at the Athenian treasury at Delphi, where they have the 2 columns and then sort of extending the colonnade, as it were, are the end walls. The narrow ends of the walls sort of stand in for columns. These are called ante. in the plural, anta in the singular, and so distyle, 2 columns, in antis for ante. The ante of the Greeks would be developed by the Romans into the architectural form that we call the pilaster, the flat representation in relief of a classical column, which the Greeks did not have. The Greeks had ante, but they did not have pilasters. So this is distyle in antis, and it was, there you are, and it was used for churches like St. Joseph's. The primary reason that a church like St. Joseph's would opt for distyle in antis rather than for the grand treatment that you see at St. Peter's Church downtown is that, well, it was cheaper. And that is always a consideration. There is another temple front church, this time a Presbyterian, not a Catholic church, in the village. It is a marvelous church, wooden, and it's the 13th Street Presbyterian Church, probably designed by the builder Samuel Thompson. Samuel Thompson, by the way, was the builder of Sailor's Snug Harbor on Staten Island, and he was also at one time the builder, though he got fired, of the Federal Hall National Memorial. Here he was the builder, and he was probably also the designer. So we would call Thompson the architect of the 13th Street Presbyterian Church, built in 1846. It was closely modeled on the Temple of Hephaestus, which was illustrated in volume 3 of the Antiquities of Athens. And here, there's the Temple of Hephaestus, and there they are side by side. The Temple of Hephaestus in Athens on the left, and the 13th Street Presbyterian Church on the right. Something that you will notice is that just as at the Custom House / Federal Hall National Memorial, the pediment, the triangular, the gabled front, which is outlined in the slanting cornices, is left bare. Whereas in the Parthenon, per Stewart and Revitt's drawing, you'll remember that it was filled with very elaborate relief sculpture. Similarly, here, although the pediment is bare, the frieze right here, this is the part of the entablature called the frieze, and in the Doric order, the frieze is decorated with these forms of 3 bars that we call triglyphs, which alternate with these square, there are rectangular areas that are known as metapees. Now, metapees in Greek architecture were another place where relief sculpture was placed, something that told some story about the glories of Greek civilization, right? There you see in the Temple of Hephaestus these rather elaborate carvings. But when you get to New York, there are the triglyphs, all right, but the metapees are blank. Why should this be? Why would New Yorkers choose to leave their metapees blank? So, one of the great questions about New York. And my own theory is that, again, it came down to money. Craftsmen in New York in the first half of the 19th century were very dear. It's a situation that didn't change until mass immigration, first of Germans and then of Italians, changed it. By the end of the 19th century, you couldn't go to Little Italy and throw a stone without beaning a skilled stone carver. But such people were not exactly plentiful in New York in, say, 1842. By the way, what is sometimes regarded as the first full-blown Greek revival building in the world, again an arguable statement, is a garden folly at Hagley Park in Worcestershire in England, designed by Athenian steward right after he got home from Greece. And it, like the 13th Street Presbyterian Church, is very closely modeled on the Temple of Hephaestus, and by the way, also leaves off the sculptured Metapees. Now, when you look at the Federal Hall National Memorial, and I want to sort of pivot the discussion now into the Greek Revival row houses of the village, but this is the way to begin. You have to look at the basics of any one of the orders. The order, as we call it, isn't just the column. And we are used to identifying the orders by the style of column capital. Most of us can look at a column and say, oh, that's a Doric column, or that's an Ionic column, or that's a Corinthian column. But the order is the column plus the horizontal piece that the columns support. The columns support something that in architectural language is called an entablature. The word entablature practically includes the word table. That's what entablature means. It means table. And an entablature in classical architecture is divided into three distinct sections. The section which is immediately atop the column, the abacus of the column capital, is called the architrave, and then above that is the frieze. Here you have the Doric frieze with the triglyphs and metapees. An Ionic frieze is different from this, and a Corinthian frieze is different from this. And then there is the overhanging eave, which tops it off, which is called the cornice. Those are the three parts of an entablature. The roof is above that, and this is a gabled roof. And when the roof itself, the gable, is outlined in cornices, it forms something that we call a pediment, the interior portion of which, where the Greeks placed sculpture and we didn't, is called a tympanum. Now, if you look at this building at Sailor's Snug Harbor, you see that it doesn't have that impressive temple front with the hexastyle or the octastyle portico. It has rather just the two columns. And this is articulated in a very neat way. This is a building, a lesser building at Snug Harbor, where they nonetheless wanted to communicate the idea of temple. They weren't going to turn it into a full-blown temple, but they nonetheless wanted to suggest the idea of temple. And the way to do that was to give the building its own discrete portico, not strapped across the whole front of the building, but something just discrete and centered in the building, where you have the portico projecting out from the front of the building with two columns only, but they support, as you can see, a full entablature. And there's another picture of it up close. Now, when you get to the urban row house, it's an obvious matter that you can't have a full temple front across a row house, and yet everybody wanted that Grecian touch in their row houses. And what was done was to adapt that kind of portico that you see at Snug Harbor to the row house. That was something that was more or less readily done. And that's what we see in these rather grand Greek Revival houses on Washington Square North. The entrance to the house is suggestive of a Greek temple. I call it the mini Greek temple entrance. And this is how you identify a Greek Revival row house, is by looking for the mini temple entrance. You can see in this picture taken from the side that it does stick out. It sticks out from the front of the house. Now, this is an illustration from the Antiquities of Athens of a building known as the Temple on the Elysos. Not only is the temple gone, but the Elysos river has been buried, so don't go looking for it. But this was arguably the most influential of all the illustrations in the Antiquities of Athens, at least in America. The Ionic order of the temple at Elysos was a very simple, very handsome, and economical variation of the Ionic order. Consequently, you see copies of this everywhere in New York. And on the right, what you are looking at is one of the Ionic column capitals of the houses on Washington Square North. They are directly taken from the illustration of the temple on the Elysos that appears in the Antiquities of Athens. And there you are again, there you are again, and again. Now, the fence, the ironwork of this era is spectacular, and it also features many Greek motifs. For instance, you see the Greek fretwork, the Greek key motif at the bottom of the fence right here, and you see that that is taken from Greek vase painting. And you can also see that there is the Anthemian motif, which is used at the top of the fence, and that you can see in the decoration of things such as this Greek sarcophagus, which is in the British Museum. This is the Merchant's House Museum. Sometimes people call this a Greek Revival house. Actually, the outside of the house, except for a few details, is still in the earlier style, the Federal style, but we would call it late Federal. It's a rather gaudy Federal style with that very heavy door frame and the fan light that looks like the French pastry chef had at it. But when you go inside, there's a very similar house, 20 St. Mark's Place. But look at the columns. It does have these full columns, and the columns on the outside of the merchant's house are the Ilisos columns, just like on Washington Square North. But what's great is that when you go inside the merchant's house, the columns that separate the front and rear parlors of the house, and goodness gracious, there can be nothing better in the world than living in a house that has full Ionic columns inside it. It's like, I've never had that, never will, but gosh, how great that would be. I think I would hug them every night. But anyway, these columns on the inside are very different from the Ionic columns on the outside. They have this necking of very elaborate low relief sculpture of palmettes, and that is based not on the temple on the Ilisos, but on another set of illustrations in the Antiquities of Athens showing the Ionic order of the Erechtheum on the Acropolis in Athens, which is a much more elaborate and more expensive variation on the Ionic. So you see both of those in the merchant's house. This is the illustration of the Erechtheum Ionic, which appears in the Antiquities of Athens. And if you don't want to go to Athens, you can go to the British Museum, because there's almost as much Greek architecture in the British Museum as there is in Athens. They have one of the columns from the Erechtheum in the British Museum. So here, side by side, there's the interior Ionic column from the merchant's house compared with the exterior Ionic column of the merchant's house, and there are, the two side by side, again, just in case you hadn't already gotten the point. Now, the other thing that I need to say about Greek Revival row houses is that there were the fancy Greek Revival row houses, and that's a category that includes the houses on Washington Square North. And then there were the less fancy Greek Revival houses, which were put up by builders or homeowners who simply weren't as rich. And consequently, they have neither the Ionic of the temple at Elysos nor the Ionic of the Erechtheum. They have something which is rather different, but which nonetheless marks them as Greek Revival. And that is that instead of columns, they use what are, we might characterize as pilasters, although perhaps you could also call them antae. They are these blocky piers which stand in for the columns that you see in the fancy houses on Washington Square North. But do note that these blocky piers support the full entablature. And so if the porches of the houses on Washington Square North are meant to be suggestive of temples, we may say that houses like these on Waverly Place are meant to be suggestive of houses that are suggestive of temples. So, in other words, they're still kind of getting that idea across, and it was still a fashionable thing. Now, when we say that there are a couple of thousand extant Greek Revival houses standing in New York City today, be very well aware that a tiny fraction of those are the full-blown sorts of things that you see on Washington Square North. The vast majority, okay, I'm just going to pull a number out of a hat, 98% of them are of this variety. You see this kind of doorway treatment on houses in the West Village, the East Village, a little bit in Chelsea, Brooklyn Heights, Cobble Hill. You see them over and over and over again, and there they are side by side. The lesser Greek Revival house on Waverly Place, lesser, it's still like $16 million. And then the elaborate Greek Revival house on Washington Square North. There are also freestanding Greek Revival houses in New York, though they're now relatively rare. There once were many more, but only a few still stand. They look just like the row houses, only they're bigger, wider, freestanding. The size of the house seems almost as though you could have strapped a full temple front across it, but it wasn't done. This is 70 Willow Street on Brooklyn Heights, and you have that entrance, which is very similar to those row houses on Waverly Place. Finally, let me just say a quick word about Lagrange Terrace, sometimes referred to as Colonnade Row on Lafayette Street, because often people call this Greek Revival, and this is exactly what makes the people who say there's no such thing as Greek Revival nutty, because what is Greek about Lagrange Terrace? I'll tell you what's Greek about it. Nothing. First of all, the base of it is rusticated. The Greeks did not use, that's the, where the stone is scored in this way. That the Greeks didn't do that. The Greeks did not do that. The Romans invented that, but used it very sparingly. And it's a technique that was really picked up in the Italian Renaissance. And it uses a Corinthian order in such a way that would have mystified the Greeks completely. So this is really, much more of a, if you want to come down to it, it's much more of a Renaissance kind of thing than a Greek thing, with of course the fact that there are a few Greek details, as would often be the case in anything built during the early 1830s. So, for example, this doorway certainly has a very Greek appearance to it. There are variations on the colonnade row concept. This is a row on Willow Place on Brooklyn Heights. And it is on that note that I think my hour is up and that I had better stop talking. What I hoped to do in this talk was to give you some sense of where and why the Greek Revival took over and some of its manifestations in the village, some ways of identifying these buildings in the village. It was a lot to cram into an hour, but I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Francis. That was so well done, so informative, and I think that our audience agrees. So I know you mentioned you wanted to keep it a little light on the questions.
Yes.
We haven't gotten, we've got a few, so I'll try to select the ones that might be the most interesting to discuss. So Stephen wants to know, are you able to talk about the Arcadian values of the Greek Revival, which seems to place it within the Romanticism of the 19th century versus the earlier Roman-influenced classicism?
Oh gosh, that's something I like to talk about. And that's what I was saying at the beginning, that the Greek Revival kind of runs into or blends into other movements, both at its beginning and at its end. At the end, it becomes really sort of part of that panoply of romantic styles, associational styles, as they are sometimes called, or revival styles of the 19th century. The romanticism being this sort of escapist thing. So, for example, there is little mystery in the fact that many of the same architects, I'm thinking of somebody like Ithiel Town or Alexander Jackson Davis, who were known for designing Greek Revival buildings, were also just as happy to design Gothic Revival buildings. The Gothic Revival buildings, were all about this highly idealized notion of the Middle Ages, which served as this kind of antidote to the, miseries of the early industrial city. And the Greek Revival served for some people in much the same way. It recalled the nobler, more purer, simpler ways of the Greeks, in contrast to the complete hash of things we've made of the world today. So there was that. I don't think that was something that was present in the origins of the Greek Revival, but I think the Greek Revival sort of blended into that mindset in the early 19th century.
Great, thank you. Joseph wants to know, what's the relationship between the use of the term Neo-Grec and the Greek Revival style?
They're loosely related. Neo-Grec is something which is specifically French, and it really developed as a sort of self-conscious set of stylistic tics among a coterie of students at the École des Beaux-Arts. It coincided with the presence of the early American students at the École, and so got transported back to America and had a certain influence in New York. But it was not Greek Revival per se, but it embodied a number of Greek-influenced ideas as a way of creating something that was kind of simpler and bolder than what some of the other students were doing, which was a moment when, just as in the time of Laugier, in the middle of the 18th century, the whole idea was to sort of throw off the complexities and what they thought to be the inanities of the Baroque, the success in the marketplace, so to speak, of the more austere styles begat its own reaction. And it's really at that moment, I think, that this sort of the battle lines were drawn up among the students in Paris. Students in Paris are always drawing up battle lines, and this was one of them. That's pretty much how I interpret what we call Neo-Grec.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So we're getting so many great questions. Unfortunately, in the interest of time, we won't be able to get to all of them. But I thought that a nice question to end with would be, Francis, what is your favorite example of Greek revival in the village?
Oh, in the village. I think probably the 13th Street Presbyterian Church. If you're looking for an institutional building, and if you're looking for a house, I'd say the interiors of the Merchant's House. That was easy.
Great. And that reminds me, I just want to thank co-sponsor the Merchant's House Museum.
Oh, right. I forgot they were the co-sponsor.
What a great tie-in. Thank you to the Merchant's House Museum. Thank you so much, Francis, for this amazing talk. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. And thanks for being here. And we hope to see you at another event soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Lena.
Take care. Have a good night.